Welcome to the Business End of Agility podcast, hosted by New Zealand's Business Agility Meetup community. We're here to bring you real-world stories from innovative organisations and forward-thinking leaders around the globe. We're going to explore all facets of business agility, from adaptive leadership and evolving company cultures to emerging ways of working, processes and technologies. I'm your host for the session, Bianca, and thank you for joining us. Welcome. Authors Tony Ponton and Phil Gadzinski, in their book Govern Agility, emphasize the need for organizations to adopt lightweight, dynamic and adaptive systems that enable faster feedback, better risk management and compliance, and of course more flexible models. However, Agile on its own can't achieve this, and it must be supported by the right governance and across all levels of the organization. Now, to help us with this, we are very lucky and excited today to have Tony join us to share his insights that he's gathered over years of experience working with organizations, and he'll help to unpack how to create a modern governance system that fosters the right culture and the right behaviors, as well as building trust and visibility, autonomy and alignment, and of course is more suitable for today's very fast-paced, changing world. All the while, we're going to talk about and highlight the critical role that humanity plays in this process. So welcome, Tony, to the podcast today.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Great to be here.
I did notice that in your bio, it actually said that you started your career in music. Quite a transition from music to governance, although reading your book, there is some similarities around music and governance. Maybe we'll start in that place.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Out of school, I was a radio announcer and played in bands and things, but basically I was in the media for a long time before I got out and started in a large enterprise, and very luckily that large enterprise decided late in the 90s, 1998, before it was called Agile, it was XP. We had the XP White Book, Kent Beck's White Book, and working with a new agile consultancy called ThoughtWorks at the time. Shout out to my friends there. And we were testing out agility, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and it's been sort of a lifetime journey for me ever since.
Fabulous. Some of that music background obviously has come in handy. In your book, you talk about this idea of conductive leadership, and we'll talk about that in a moment or two. So I'm interested to see how some of that will transition through. But, governance sometimes is a bit of a dirty word. It's kind of associated with a few layers, a fair bit of red tape, a fair bit of checking, and more of the stick than the carrot. So in your book, you talk about how to create governance that actually does what it's supposed to do. In your mind, what does great governance look like? Let's just start with that for a second. So what is the ideal when we're talking about governance in reality?
Well, I think you have to take a little step sideways on that and say, what do you mean by governance, and what do you mean by governing? So when we talk about it, we talk about governing the system as governance. In the word governance has been abstracted too many times, if you like. We talk about governing the system as a whole. So it flows through the whole of your system. It's not just PMOs, it's not projects, it's or portfolios, because if you're handing over the governing of your system to a singular area and charging them with governing everything that's happening within your organization, then you've created a bottleneck. Good governing systems and create flow. They allow you to flow the value through the organization, and they allow you to make decisions. They allow you to see what you need to see to make the decisions expediently. So you're still able to manage your risk, your impediments, your dependencies, the killers of work, but it's about flowing it through the organisation. It's about being able to see your strategic intent to your execution, and your execution to your strategic intent, but seeing the flow across the organisation to enable that. So when we talk about governing systems, that's what good governance looks to us. It's a modernising the ability. It's not the checklists. It's not those things. Not to say that those things aren't important, right? But let's just look at that. The thing that we talk about there quite regularly, Phil and I, when we're doing these talks around this, is that a lot of the governance built into organisational systems have been built up over many, 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 many years. It's what we call organisational detritus. Right? It's not the layers on the bottom of a rainforest. It's just built up over time. So something went wrong. So we governed that. We put something on top of that,
Mm.
something on top of that, put something on top of that, right? So when you hear us talk about this a lot, and we'll talk about it as we go through today, we talk about the need for guardrails versus guide rails. So that's the other thing. When you're asking what good governing systems look like, they understand the difference between guardrails and guide rails, and we use that quite significantly, right? So the guardrails are the last thing you see before you go off a cliff, theoretically, right? They're the things that are meant to be the thing that stop you.
Safety.
Safety, right? So in organisations, there is a need for guardrails.
Mm.
You definitely need those, right? Even think back to David Marquet's book, if anybody's listening and they've read, Turn the Ship Around and Intent-Based Leadership. He says in that nice, video that he does that everybody's seen, or if you haven't, you will see it after this. You'll go and look at it, right? He says in there, he kept the decision to press the nuclear button or launch a missile because that was something that could create, maximum damage, right? That's the same in an organisation. So they're kind of guardrails. And the guide rails are actually different to that. Guide rails are like, if you think about the cars that we have today, and they have the guidance systems on them, and you head over the line, what does it do? It brings you back on, right? And it says this is the direction that we need to go. So you want more guide rails than you do guardrails, because if you're able to actually have the right guide rails built into your governing system, then intentionally that creates flow.
Mm. I love that. I think it's the first time I've probably heard governance talked about in a way of achieving flow in the system, but also that transparency from strategy all the way to that delivery, getting that across the board. And who wouldn't want that? Interestingly, when you talked about those layers and layers that form of all of the things that we put in place once something goes amiss and you put some structure on, I remember reading in your book there was a phrase about it being a bit like a tower of rubbish, and what happens when you have a tower of rubbish, it releases methane gas, which is poison. And it's a little bit similar to, governance systems that have been built on over time. So if somebody was to go, well, let's take that tower of rubbish away and just start from the fundamentals and the basics. You talk about the 5 stanchions. Let's talk about those, but maybe start with the stanchions first. Like, an interesting word, not often used. Let's talk about that and why you chose it, and then what the stanchions are.
Yeah, all right, let's go there. So, what the hell is a stanchion? Okay, well, look, I think we wanted to find something, A, that people would remember, so we've achieved that. But B, that also didn't go with that classic pillars and frameworks and, all these sort of different things that have been seen. And the stanchions actually represent a stanchion. What is a stanchion? A stanchion, have you ever been to the movies, or you've been to the airport, right? You know those silver poles with the tape that direct you where to
Yes.
go? That's what a stanchion is. If you look it up, that's what a stanchion is, right? And the reason we looked at that is because they actually provide direction to create flow.
Mm.
They help you get where you need to go, and you can move them as the situation changes. So think about, in a concert lineup or airport or one of those things, those things get moved. They shift them across in terms of need and in terms of what they need to do to adapt to the situation. They're also the kind of thing that you can take away when you don't need them anymore.
Mm.
And so we look at the stanchions as the things that help you guide yourself to get there in the way that you want to get to improve and modernise your governing systems, right? But it also means that what happens is when you don't really need them, or you need less of them, as we just talked about, right? Then you're able to adjust with that as well. And so that's what the stanchions are for us. And they were a way for us to containerise the thoughts around these patterns that we had seen. How the stanchions really came about, when we were looking, Phil and myself had been working together for quite some time at a consultancy together. Previously, both of us have worked in agility. I'm probably older than him. He'll tell you that every time, Ryan. I've been doing it a long time, as you heard, 1998. We'd had the pleasure of working across the world, and we were seeing the same patterns. We were seeing the same patterns in organisations that were thriving and surviving through that whole COVID-ish period, right? Thriving and surviving. And then we were actually seeing the ones that weren't actually being able to shape and move their governing systems were the things that were creating the problem, we could see these patterns every single time. And so what we did was we crystallise them into what we believe are the 5 stanchions that would allow us to discuss how you would change that. And then we went about testing them. And so I think that's the thing I want to say about the book. If anybody's listening, it's just, here's another guy just telling me he's selling a framework or whatever, right? We're not actually selling a framework, right? So that's why we wanted to pop it in that terms of the stanchions. These are the patterns that you can see. We give you some thoughts about how we've seen how you can improve and the things that you need to do about those patterns, but you can take that away. The important thing here, I think, to say about those patterns is we tested them. We didn't just write about them. We went out and we actually had the opportunity to work with them and try them with different organisations and test them. And, that's what I do right now. I spend a lot of time with organisations helping them work through those situations.
And they're great lenses to look through to even look at what your current governance is and kind of take each of those areas and reflect. The 5 stanchions, the first one is conductive leadership, of course, and that's where our little music analogy comes in. Tell us, what is conductive leadership?
Yeah.
And your thoughts around that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And a lot of people go, what is that one all about, right? Okay. So conductive leadership is an interesting thing. Again, as I said, we've been here a long time and looking at these things, and I'll take just a slight step before I talk about it. When I talk about the governing the systems, the thing I say to people is, how did we get here? By the way, you did mention previously, and I probably didn't answer, and I should have, because it patches into this about governance. I'm an agilist, right, and I'm as responsible as anyone for putting governance in the corner, because we always saw governance as the thing that was the inhibitor, or it was too hard to tackle.
Yeah.
And because governance, when you start to look under the hood of governance, it actually covers a number of things if you're talking about that. And one of those is leadership, so that's why it's important to patch into this. The other stanchions will make themselves known in a moment. But if you don't tackle that, you end up with a 3-speed economy. And that's what we were seeing in the organisations that brought us to these patterns, right? So what we're seeing is literally you've got your strategic alignment, your strategy and your leadership tend to know where they're going. If not, you've got a whole set of different problems, right?
Yeah.
So, a lot of our time as agilists, a lot of time on organisations who say they're going to be transformational, they've spent a lot of time creating squads, pods, tribes, teams, crews,
Guilds, chapters, so forth and so forth. Yes.
I think I got them all. Didn't I get all the jazzy names, right? Because that was the easier place to do it. Now, I hear a lot that Agile's failed across places, right? When we were looking at these patterns and we're starting to distill, it's very obvious to us that you have a 3-speed economy when you've done this. Your strategic intent and alignment's particularly going one way. Your flow of work may be heading in the same way, may be heading in a different way, because you haven't looked at that governing layer that should permeate everything. It's been centralised to that middle layer. And so basically you have your governing and your funding going in different directions, or traditional, or whatever it may be. And so what you're reaching is a complexity ceiling. You're reaching a point where the system has become so complex that you're paying a complexity tax. And that complexity tax is in the millions, the tens of millions. Worse, it's in time, it's in scope, it's in value delivered, and most importantly, it's in people, which patches me into this piece, right? So when you reach that complexity ceiling and that complexity tax, you really have to look at the governing of the whole system. So, and when I say, how do we get here? I'm just as responsible. We, the agilists, we, the leaders, we, the project managers, we, the scrummer, we, the community, we, the consultants, put it in the corner because it was too damn hard, right? And we have a saying, govern agility, nobody puts governance in the corner anymore. So anybody who's a Dirty Dancing fan, I got the right age.
Yeah.
Get that?
Well.
Go Google it. Anyway, I know that's a bit long-winded, but it does introduce the fact of why we were looking at leadership. Because when we were looking at leadership is part of governing the system. If your leadership is not involved in governing the system, then governance isn't part of your everyday flow of work. what we see is leadership abdicates autonomy of that to groups and expect the risk group to manage that, and then inform, right? You can't abdicate. You have to be involved. You have to collaborate. And so part of that is we're looking at leaders and we're saying, okay, well, leadership needs to be involved in this. Now, there's a whole bunch of different terms out there for leadership, right? And we've all heard them. We talked about intent-based leadership. There's leading with intent if you're looking at, the Stephen Bungay, or the worst one is servant leadership. I'm just going to pop up on my little podium there and upset a few agilists, but one of the worst terms ever invented. I've been doing this my third decade. Leaders do not and will not accept that servant leadership. You can try and parse that with them as much as you can. The intent of it's great. The language of it's terrible. And I had a senior leader who said I've had senior leaders on more than one occasion say to me, I'm nobody's servant. And one that I used in my talk recently said to me, and I've said, I'm going to use that. He goes, I'm nobody's servant. I don't even pick up after my kids. Right?
The connotations around it, isn't it?
So it's the connotations around it. So, sorry, that's my little thing. But so when we were looking at leadership, we were looking for a term that really encapsulated all of those things, because you need a mix of all of those things, and you need to think about how you work within the flow of work, and you're enabling it. And so we saw this great video about conductors. So when we talk about conductive leadership, we're truly talking about being more conducive, being a conductor. So let me give you a thought around that, right? So the reason that we go to that is because think about leadership in terms of that, right? Do you see a conductor actually jumping into the orchestra pit and doing the work? Do you see them actually telling you what you're going to do, where you're going to do, how you're going to do it? Do you see them actually stopping and walking over and saying, hey, get this going, right? No, you don't, right? They're not in the flow of work, but they're part of the flow of work. If you watch a conductor, now I used to think that they just used to wave their sticks like everybody else, and I always thought, well, what's the value do these people add, right? But actually, it's very interesting. So if you watch them, and you'll watch them differently after this, you'll see somebody, and for example, if I was doing this in an audience situation, Bianca, I'd pick on you because I know you, and I'd say, look, here's Bianca. She just played a bad note. You will get a double tap from that stick, and then he'll move on. And that's to let you know, hey, you didn't get that right. You need to fix that before we do the next part, right? Or he might, the tempo's not quite right over here. I can hear the tempo's not right. You need to slow the tempo. And so what he's doing is he's making expedient decisions. He's actually steering. He's not doing. He's working with them. And so too often in governing systems, it becomes that archetypal, do what I say, do what I have to do, etc. Or they abdicate, not collaborate. And so what we're looking for in that conductive leadership, we're looking for people to be more conducive, right? So that means leading with intent. Those mechanisms of intent-based leadership and Stephen Bungay's leading with intent, and any of those kind of things that we've seen that work with that. But we're looking for that leading with intent, but from the intentionality of governing the system and creating flow, right? Giving that clarity of focus. And like I said, steering, not doing. If you think about Esther Derby's SEAM model, if you've not come across that, we highly love that. Every organisation's built in this model: steering, enabling, enhancing, and making. And the question to ask as leaders, if you're being conductive, are you spending more time stuck in execution than you are actually steering? Enabling and enhancing the work to get done, right? So, and the other part of that is one of the big jobs is enabling collaboration with flow. That's not an easy thing. Sounds like it just rolled off the tongue beautifully, didn't it? Enabling collaboration and flow. But actually enabling your teams, enabling your organisation, enabling your people to collaborate in order to create flow is one of the hardest jobs for a leader. Remember Jack Welch's old quote, what's a leader's job? Is to enable your people and get the hell out of the way so they can get the work done. And that's what that conductive leadership is really about. And when you think about that in terms of governing the system and governance, leaders have to be involved in the everyday flow of work, or you're abdicating, not collaborating.
Yeah, great. A great phrase, abdicating and not collaborating. And with that analogy, there's a sense that you have to be present. So you're aware all of the time of how the parts are coming together. And then you're giving feedback to the system to get harmony across the whole as opposed to an individual silo or an area as well. So, yeah, there's some great thoughts to take away in that space.
Yeah. So
Next bench. Sorry, you go.
no, you go, you go, you go.
Well,
If you don't stop me, I'll go. And I'll keep going.
Well, that's good because there's a lot to go in this space. Let's talk about sensible transparency because us agilists, we love us a bit of transparency, or I should say, a lot of transparency.
We
So
do.
tell us, what do we mean by sensible transparency, and how do we bring that about?
Yeah. So just think. I was just picking up something you just said before when you were commenting after I'd spoken, and you're talking about leadership needs to be able to see. So again, all of these are symbiotic. I need to make that
Mm,
point. Everything we talk about in terms of the stanchions are symbiotic. In other words, they rely on each other, um, even codependent, if you like, in most instances, right? So if you get something out of kilter with the other, then your system is out of kilter, right? And that's why we know that these patterns are so symbiotic. So sensible transparency. So when we started writing this transparency, I mean, it's not a new thing to people, right? So and a lot of things we talk about here, but here's the thing: there's lots of transparency spoken about, and it's probably gone overboard a little bit. Again, I'm going to say some things today, and sometimes I wonder if I get out of conferences and things without people chasing me with a pitchfork. But anyway, the reality of it is that talking about things like radical transparency and everything must be shown, and we need to be able to see everything that's happening. The
mm,
reality of it is that's okay, maybe in a startup and a scale up. And I always caveat that because they're a different kind of situation, right? But even in those, there's some things that you really can't be transparent about. Enterprise organisations, you can't be transparent about some things. You absolutely can't because it could be legislative, it could be fiduciary, it could be regulatory. What you can
mm,
be is transparent about what you can't be transparent about, right? So this is why we coined the phrase sensible transparency. Because you have to be sensible about what you're transparent about and how we're going to be transparent about. And then what are the things that we need to do to make the transparency useful or sensible to the organisation, right? So when we talk about that, we talk about things like single demand view. Sounds like an interesting one when we talk about governance, right? But when I walk into organisations, the first thing that I talk to them about, and if I'm talking with enterprise leaders or CFOs or C spaces, right, the first thing I ask them is, have you got a single demand view? Can you show
mm,
me your demand versus your in progress versus your capacity to deliver? And no, I don't mean just your CapEx. I mean your CapEx, your OpEx, and any innovation or discretionary kind of work. Because you as a leader should be able to see that right through your governing systems. How can you govern the system? How can you make decisions on risk, dependency,
mm.
impediments? How can you make those decisions if you can't see that? And when I say that, I mean that in real time, not in retrospect. That's a really important thing here as well. We'll talk about that because it's symbiotic to something we'll talk about shortly in terms of the tooling. But you need to be able to see that in a real time instance because if you're lagging, you're going to end up with, everybody's heard the old watermelon project kind of thing, right? It's green, the watermelon's
Screen.
green, and you drop it on the ground, it goes red,
Yes.
right? And then everybody runs around. Well, I say there's an extra phase to that. It's called code brown, and it hits the fan. And
Mm.
everybody spends an inordinate amount of time running around because you didn't know. And that's why my co-author and Phil and I have a bit of a backwards and forwards over this. I'm not a real fan of RAG status when it comes to this single demand view and any of this stuff that we talk about transparency because I'm not sure I've seen any amber with a touch of green ever.
I was reading something that said, I think it was called the distortion effect
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or the mum effect. And basically, it's like the teams will let you know that they're not going to be able to deliver on time. The status is red. That goes up. That gets a little filter added to it, and it suddenly becomes a bit orange. And then by the time it gets to the top, miraculously the status has changed to green, because every time that we start to escalate things, we put a more positive spin on things,
Yep.
whether it's from sheer optimism or other reasons,
Yeah.
to save face or, you know, those sorts of things.
Are you on track? Are you off track? If you're
Yeah.
off track, what do we need to do to get you on track? No, you're
And
not
what is
getting.
the specific things we're off track? Because that's real information, not
This is
just
it. Yeah.
off. Yeah.
And you're not just a little off track. You're off track. I don't care whether you're little or not. If you're Australian, there's a song, "Little things, big things grow," right? Well, that's what happens. And so, I think if you're looking at that, you really have to be honest about that. So, and that's a massive theme when you talk about that single demand view, is that ability to understand what's happening in your organisational construct, right? And that enables you to create flow. So the other thing we talk about in that transparency is strategic alignment. You heard me talk about that before, right? It's a big thing that we see. So there's the thing we talk about, the collaborative connective tissues of an organisation. So that is the horizontal flow of information across your organisation, hooking into your vertical, which is your strategic alignment to your execution to your strategic alignment, right?
Totally.
So you can use that any way you like. It can be, objectives and key results or whatever it be, but it's that in strategic intent, making sure that you understand that the work that's being done actually matches your strategic intent. There's a lot of cottage industries. I can tell you, when you start doing this with organizations and you get that collaborative connective tissue, all of a sudden there's a lot of work that we're going, well, where did that come from? Why are you working on that? That doesn't align with our strategic intent. Why are we spending money on that? What kind of cottage industry have we just created here, right? So in terms of that, what we're talking about is that bi-directional flow, the bi-flow of information, right? We need to have that flow of information across the organisation and up and down the organisation, and hooking them together, giving that collaborative connective tissue. And when we do that, we need to do that in a way that invites inquiry, because it's easy to do that, to invite the intention of who did that, what happened, how did it, right? So that's why it links back
Yeah.
into the leading of the system. Your leaders have to be involved in the everyday flow. Governance has to be part of your everyday flow of work. And therefore, you need to have the transparency to be able to see that, to understand that, right? When I do this talk, normally there's a piece where I pause and go, if you don't have this transparency, then you get this silence, right? And silence is the sound of risk piling up.
Oh, that's a good way of describing it.
Yeah, and by the way, I can't take ownership of that quote. That's a Kent Beck quote from his, but we love that quote.
Noted.
Nothing more or nothing less true than that in an organisational construct. If you can't see, that's what's happening.
I love that. Done in a way that invites inquiry. Let's talk about patterns of work, the third stanchion.
Yeah, so the reason we use patterns of work, and we came to that thing, there's lots of those terms out there, the system of work, but we didn't want to confabulate that with a lot of the intentions or contentions that go around that, right? But if you're looking at your organisational construct and you need transparency and you need your leadership, conductive leadership working together, you actually have to think about your patterns of work. How is the work done in your organisation? Because you need to design that for flow. It's not going to happen. It has to be intentional, right? It literally has to be intentional, that you look at the patterns of work in order to create flow. And when I talk about flow, let me just stop there, because I've used that word a few times today, right? It's the buzzword at the moment. I hear flow so many times in organisations, and I have to stop people and say, I know you're using that word, but I don't think you know what that word actually means in the context of what we're talking about, right? So what we're talking about here is a twofold thing of flow. Your patterns of work have to be obviously constructed so that you create flow of value from idea to the customer in order to provide the value back to the organisation. But there's a twofold thing. Your patterns of work have to be designed for the flow of information. We just talked about it. Transparency. So I often talk to people about, well, if you want a single demand view, you need to look at your flow of work. Because if your flow of work, and this is where, again, don't come for me with the pitchforks, but I'm a pragmatic agilist, right? There's a level of standardisation that you have to apply in an organisational construct.
Yep.
to allow you to roll that information up. So you have to think about that, right? Without going off the ranch, if you know what I mean, from an agile or agility perspective. You don't want to make it so tight that teams are all trying to do the same thing. You have to give them space to be able to work and move. But there are certain things that have to be done, like the work breakdown. I can't have someone using apples, someone using oranges, someone using bananas, and someone over here using heavens knows what, and then try to roll that up, right? The instance of trying to flow that information makes it very hard. You also have to design your patterns of work to enable your ability to lead. And that means what you're looking to do, if you're trying to apply conducive leadership and you want that intent-based leadership, you have to create your patterns of work so that it distributes your decision-making. Right? Agility by rote, when you apply it to an organisation, disseminates control. That's what it's built to do, right? The problem with that is when you take control away from a traditional kind of leadership or organisational enterprise, that means you only leave one lever to pull, and that's command. And so then what you hear is you will, you have to, you must. And part of that whole piece is, yes, you can work with leaders to start to instill that, but the system itself has to actually enable that as well. So you need to look at where you can distribute decision-making. It's about enabling the humans in the flow, and we'll talk about that shortly as well, right? So the other thing about that is, and I'm glad I preempted it previously, is because whenever we talk about patterns of work, it's adjusting to the guide rails, not guardrails.
Right? Yeah.
And people say, we can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that. I'll give you a really good story. It wasn't long after COVID that I was working with an organisation, and we were talking to them about, it was a panel that we had them on. There was a very preeminent leader from a superannuation organisation. We say, well, what are the changes you made? And they said, interestingly enough, one of the changes that we've decided to make is we're looking at how we rule or how we govern our system. And we said, well, what do you mean by that? And said, well, literally, to get people to do work, to get things done in remote because we weren't ready for it, we had to wind back a lot of rules to enable them to get the work done and there were risks involved in that, but we put mechanisms in place then. So that's interesting. She said, yeah, it was such to the point of view that we looked at these rules and said, why have we got them in the first place? And so the story from before, some of those things, they didn't even know why they were doing. They didn't know why they're doing it. They're just doing it because that's the way they've always done it, right? And a good friend of mine, Sharon Robson, she has a great saying, thwarting is the enemy of all organisations. That's the way we always did it.
Yes.
The Dark Lord of Thwatty, she calls it, right? Shout out to Sharon. But it's a great saying because that's exactly where it is. So you want those guide rails and not the guardrails, and you want to assess those so that you're in a situation that enables you as an organisation to create that flow. And then the last thing about that is think about enabling dynamic reteaming. In fact, I even take it one step further than that, is thinking about it as enabling dynamic operating and teaming models. Right? Your organisation and your teams is going to change. So I like to paraphrase a quote from my good friend Heidi Heflin. If you've not read her book, Dynamic Reteaming or Reteaming, she says, if your teams are going to change, so you better get damn good at it, right? Well, here's the thing for me. Your operating and teaming models are going to change. Therefore, your governance needs to change. So you better get good at it because otherwise your organisation's going to suffer. And you're going to end up in that complexity ceiling and you're going to end up paying a complexity tax that, quite frankly, as an organisation, you may not be able to recover from. And you only have to stop and look in the year 2024 into 25 and ongoing, how many organisations don't exist anymore. And when you start to look at it, did they address their governing systems?
Which is the very mechanism that should be there to help them navigate difficult times.
Correct. That's correct.
Interesting, you were saying before around teams and, obviously in the agile space, every team being able to set up the best ways of working for them, but there's still that need for that connective tissue between the teams in order for it to have flow across the whole system.
Correct.
So making sure that we focus on that. One of the things in your book too, I thought was a good little visualization for leaders to be able to, feel like and see what's going on and that the system is good and the system's healthy or the notes are all kind of playing in the right order. is that level of transparency of what the teams are using in terms of ways of working, sort of, transparency on teams sharing that this is what they're doing and how they're doing it, so that between all the teams, they can obviously moderate together more easily as well.
Correct.
And something about, we have to take more time or make more conscious effort for that, because we are in knowledge work and that work is hidden, as opposed to a factory where it's more obvious that you can see a bottleneck is occurring, or it's more obvious that a machine is broken down, or it's more obvious that there's nobody in that area, or whatever it is. So some good insights there. It seems to me that all throughout this, there's this very prevalent idea that the governance that you put in place is not a fixed governance either, that it always needs to be inspected and changed and adapted itself, is what I'm sort of hearing from what you're saying.
And hence why we call it Govern Agility, the way we call the book Govern Agility, right? We didn't call it Govern Agile, right? So let me make a clear point here too. I want to pick up on you talking about agile teams, but this works with any kind of teams. I've worked with organisations who are, manufacturing, and you wouldn't apply some of the things that we would. This works in any shape or form in any organisational construct when you're talking about that, right? So that's a very important thing when you're talking about these concepts. I think organisationally, you can get out of step with what's happening in the teams, and you need to give that autonomy to the teams to work in a certain way. But again, it goes back to the guide rails and the guardrails and the collaborative connective tissues, I think, is the answer to your question, Yoko. Regardless of how you set this up and how you work with your governing systems, you have to have that in place.
Critical area to focus on. Let's talk about another critical area, your fourth stanchion, which is data-driven reasoning.
Yeah. So all of these things we talked about rely on data. And, the question there, everybody said data-driven decisions, informed data decisions, data-informed, etc., right? And whilst I don't disagree with the sentiment of that, the reason we came to data-driven reasoning is when you look at organisations, they have a plethora of data, but are they using them in the right way? So you can just look at data that's being generated and you can make decisions, right? And there's that whole story, I forget the actual saying, I think, is, but the data doesn't lie. No, but it will tell you untruths and it will hide things. So what we talk about is you need to take that data and reason with it. Now, whether that's using, in the last, since we wrote the book, AI has really taken off. And people say, well, where does AI fit in this? Well, AI is just another tool or another mechanism or another enabler for you to take that data and reason against it. But in the end, you're actually looking at that human concept of making informed directional decisions based on the data-driven reasoning. So we talk about when you're doing data-driven reasoning that we want to make informed directional decisions. What's a directional decision? Well, a directional decision, let's go with this. How many decisions did you make when you got out of bed today before you even got to work?
I'm sure it must have been at least 10.
Yeah, right. So kids go there, do this, dog go there, you go there, right?
In which order to do these things and what time, gas needed, not needed.
Directional decisions, right? So let's extrapolate that to your work life. As soon as you walk into work, how many directional decisions do you make?
I would dread to think.
Thousands and thousands in a day, right? So here's the other thing. In terms of leaders who are doing this as well, right? How many of those are made based on data-driven reasoning or just gut feel or the highest paid person's opinion in the room? So the reality of it is you make those thousands and thousands of different decisions, and a large number of those are going to be wrong if you're not actually thinking about how you apply that. Remember, data trumps opinion. And to make informed directional decisions, you have to be able to do that, right? And you want to take that data not only just to do that kind of thing, you want to introspect that data, right? So you can retrospect it. Yeah, well, I'm not you've got nothing wrong with retrospectives, but you certainly want to introspect that data at the same time, right? We have this information. And that means you want to use that to improve. You want to create those insights and then create those probes that you can probe, sense, and respond and improve and constantly so that you get that information back to you. You know, if you think about it, digital tool sets in that, it's always going to be essential now with digital tool sets to give you, we were talking about it just before, right? The digital tool sets, and I'm getting around to your tool question, right?
Mm.
The tools become inherently important because the tools give you the information and the ability to make those decisions. You know, I was involved in a massive program once where, you know, they'd been running for a couple of years. And I think the first thing that we did when it hadn't been successful when we first came into that program was created the ability to see. You know, we had teams across 3 different continents, hundreds of people, and they're all working in different ways with different tools. How do you get that single demand view? So, you know, the data-driven ability to do that is so essentially important. And just from the point of view of being able to understand so many different things, like what's your return on investment?
Mm.
What's your flow of value that's actually going? What's your return on investment? What's your first pass resolution? In other words, how much stuff's getting out there and how much comes back without you actually having to intervene? Data-driven reason becomes eminently important in today's world. And with AI, that only exacerbates the amount of information that you can get to your fingertips. But how do you use that to actually improve constantly and forever within your organisational construct, right? And so that's why I have no problems with the retrospectives, because you need to do some of that stuff and improve the teams. There's a lot of that information you need immediately. And if you look at programs and things like that, have you ever been to a PIR, you know, program implementation review, right? Okay. What happens with the insights that come out of that stuff? 9 times out of 10?
Goes into the same tower we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, that's right. Or there's a little pat on the back, we did really well, and we'll fix those things, and it never happens, right? So you have to take that next bit and improve. And that's why this links into your governing system. So if you think, well, that's, you know, your governing systems are as responsible for that. You asked me about the adaptive governance. I'm getting to the answer now. Sorry it took so long, but the reality of it is your governance has to be adaptive. It has to be able to move with what's happening. If you put static governance in, and the way you govern the system, you will create that complexity ceiling. You'll reach that bottleneck moment. Does that mean that everything changes in it? Not necessarily, but you do need to address it. And people often say to me when I say that in this part of it, they go, "Oh, you know, the risk people." I've talked to a lot of risk people, and a lot of risk people go, "Oh, thank God someone's talking about the fact that people have to be involved in this and they have to address it."
And have the shared ownership over it, right? You
Shared
know,
ownership. What happens? Your poor old CRO, your chief risk officer, whatever it be, they get it thrown over here. Again, abdication, not collaboration, right? And you're responsible first line defence, and you're responsible second line. Yeah, they might be responsible for it, but who's accountable? Who's involved?
Mm.
They can't control everything that happens in your organisation for you. And so the ability to imbibe this data to allow you to do data-driven reasoning becomes part of your whole governing system.
And something about that, you know, data itself is the quality of the data and the metrics that we're using. And I know in the book, for those that are interested on the call, there are some suggestions in there around different metrics that you could or should be looking at as well. So there's some art to be thinking about that, and the regular nature in which we should be looking at that data.
Correct.
Because, you know, the human brain is a funny thing. And I was looking at something the other day, and it was, there's this belief perseverance bias, which is once we have a belief about something, even if the data is presented to us, which is contrary to our belief, we will continue on to try and find data that supports our belief instead. So being able to keep that data front and center before we anchor ourselves into certain beliefs obviously is important in this space as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what exactly what we say, data-driven reasoning. That's a great. I'm going to steal that from you, by the way, because that is exactly what happens.
Yeah.
You can use data to validate anything if you want to, and so that goes back to my saying, data doesn't lie, but it'll tell fibs.
Can't tell fibs. Well, let's talk about we've saved the best for last, and this is humanity. And often humanity might not be associated with the word governance. Let's talk about how it came to be as a stanchion and what does it mean?
It's an interesting thing. Okay, so I'll do a little side story of this just quickly because I think it's worthy of it. As you might know, the book itself was a COVID baby. We like to call it that because we were locked down, and there was a little bit of secret sauce involved, and we had this cast backwards and forwards because Phil was in Melbourne and I was in Brisbane. We had a few other people that said, "You should write a book." We should write a book, so we started writing the book. We've been involved with the Heart of Agile and Alistair Coburn for many, many years. Both Phil and I are Heart of Agile guides. And I say that because it's inherently important to this, is that we asked him to review our book, and he obviously does one of the introductions in the book. We asked him, and he duly did, and he came back with a lovely 3 or 4 pages of red light stuff marked up, and a nice little line. There were 2 lines at the bottom. One of them was lovely. It was really good book. But where's the humans? And we both went, oh my goodness. We inherently had put them into each of the stanchions, but we hadn't really called them out as its own stanchions. And he was exactly right. So so that caused us some time to go back and reflect and rewrite and think about it. And the reality is we call it humanity is the cornerstone. Because everything we've talked about today is the people. So people do people things, or humans do human things, if you don't make them part of the governing systems. And often governing systems are built without a thought of how the people are going to manage them, how they're going to use them, and how it affects their ability to work. And ultimately, that's the ability to create flow, right? So we go back to flow again. So to us, humanity is the important things. Humans are the blip in the radar. You can standardise, you can mechanise, you can do whatever you like. But humans will do human things if you haven't made it in a way that enables them. And so when we talk about humanity as a cornerstone, there's a few really strong themes, right? So firstly is autonomy. We need to be able to provide the guardrails and the guide rails that enable the autonomy for people to manage the governing of the system. Governance is part of your everyday flow of work. I'll go there again, right? So that's why we say you need to put agile in your governance, or agility in your governance, not governance in your agile, right? Because that's super important. The second part of that is creating the trust, the actual trust in people. So a lot of governing systems that have been built over the years actually work on the premise of not trusting people's responses to it and putting in the mechanisms that actually try to cover for every single instance. But the reality of it is, when I talk to people about that and governing people, I go, that's great. What if I do that? Oh, what if I do that? It's not in your tick list. You can't do that, right? So
There'll always be a workaround as soon as you put, something in place, then.
yeah. So if you provide the autonomy for people, you involve them in the governing of the system, and you trust them to manage that, and you trust them to actually help you improve that. So remember, they're part of the data sequence as well. They're part of the flow of information back, up and down, that enables you to adapt your governance. And with that means that you do need to have that sense of responsibility and accountability, right? Where's the responsibility? Who's responsible? Who's accountable for it? Because often they get mixed up. And people are made responsible and accountable, and then that creates that block of the flow as well. And if you want to read a really good book on that, my good friend Christopher Avery does a great book called The Responsibility Process. And the reason I say that is because he talks so eloquently about the difference between responsibility and accountability. That means you've got to scale down. You really have to scale down the mechanistic controls. So that goes back to my command and control, etc. We've all heard that. But the reality is you do have to scale down the mechanistic controls, enable the autonomy and the trust in people, and give them the responsibility and accountability where necessary. Now, whenever I do this conversation or talk, or I'm talking to executives about this, they go, well, you're just turning it over to the inmates. That's not the case. So we there's a particular saying that we used to use the Russian version of that. We don't use it anymore for obvious reasons, but it came out of the Reagan administration when they were dealing with the foreign policies, and what it equates to is trust but verify. And so everything that we do when we're working with organisations to imbue the new modernise their agility is how can we trust but verify. We're going to trust you to do this, but we're going to verify it. We still need verification. Just means that we want to lightweight, we want to modernise that. Right? I'll give you an example. You can have an organisation that might have massive annual funding, right? You want to roll that funding down into bucket funding. And so, I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you, 500 million, and you're going to manage that. I'm going to trust but verify with that. So what do I mean by that? Okay, we've done the budget, we've worked through, you said 500 million is what you got. Okay, we trust you to manage that, but we also need to verify that so we don't end up with some watermelons. So what are the mechanisms that we can put in that enable us to verify, all good, going well, great, etc. Okay, we've got a problem. How do we adjust? On track, off track, those kind of things. But you can see that trust but verify, and it even goes down into into the teams. You're trusting the team to get the work done, but you're also verifying where it's at. So that for us, that's a very big thing, is the trust but verify mechanism.
And transparency plays a lot into that as well as part of that verify. And verify doesn't mean necessarily that there's a consequence of epic proportions to it. It could be, we all make innocent mistakes. It could be that there is an error that just needs to be corrected, a lesson to be learned that will actually save a lot of risk in the future. There's lots of learnings to be had as we go through.
And the reason it's in the middle, or it is the cornerstone, is because it's all stitched together. As I said, it's all symbiotic, right? So you rightly draw the analogy, which was perfect, but you also draw that analogy, your leadership needs to trust but verify, not verify but not trust. It's change, right? Your patterns of work need to be able to set up so that you can enable the ability to be able to see, you can flow the work, but you can have that trust but verification coming through it, your data, etc. And all of that around your governing system means it's enabling your ability to.
In your book, you had a very clear statement around the power of being able to have more agility in your governance was the ability and the opportunity for people to be able to take more responsibility in the very finest sense of the word.
Yes.
Because people do care about what they're delivering for their customers and the quality of that, and they do genuinely care about their workmates, and they do genuinely care about the organisation that they've given so much of their lifetime to, regardless of how long they've been in that organisation. So it sort of sits into that fairy wise space, that people, if given the opportunity, do care and will be able to work on that. And there's a responsibility to support them through capability and the right tools and the right skills and so forth to be able to support that.
That's 100% correct. I mean, most people within an organisation or a team structure, whatever it be, they're trying to do the best job they possibly can, both from a sense of pride of what they do. If you talk to most people, nobody. I've said a lot to leaders over the period of time, regardless of whether it was governing systems or anything else I'm doing when I'm working with them, is that how many people come to work to do a crap job?
Yeah.
They're very few, right? And very few just want to be able to do the job, do it well, and do it to the best of their context. And if you provide the right guardrails, the right guide rails, the right patterns of work, you have that enabling leadership that enables them to do that, and the systems that encourage them to do so, then you're going to get a better result. And governing the system is no difference. If your governing mechanisms are bound around nothing more or nothing less than being the arbiter of risk, being the arbiter of flow, and control all of those mechanisms, and you have a bottleneck and you have this learned helplessness where they just go, okay, well, that's not our problem, it's their problem. And I've heard that, right? I've worked in teams who just go, yeah, whatever, it's their problem, not mine. And then you inherently have a problem within your organisation. So it all abounds around. That's why we talk about it as governing the system as a whole. We have a different look at governance rather than just the old archetypal governance situation.
So coming back to our conductive analogy in the beginning, I guess is being able to see where we're slightly out of tune and tune it as we go and to get a better harmony and sound and delivery across the board.
Yeah, that's correct.
So tell me, how can people find more information about you and obviously your book, Govern Agility, as well?
Yeah, sure. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So you can find Tony Ponton on LinkedIn and Phil Gadzinski. He'd be just as happy. I'll dob him in. You can find us at www.governagility.com.au. You can find the book there, or you can find the book on all good bookstores, as they say. You might even find it in the bargain bin. But you can find it on Amazon, iBooks, or wherever it might be. And yeah, if you want to reach out to us, we're always happy to chat as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll put the links in the description as well for everyone to be able to find those things easily. And don't worry, I have read the book myself, and it is in language that is very conversational, very easy to understand. So it's not a boring book. It's a very interesting book. And I have from time to time followed different rabbit holes of things that you've mentioned and different articles and things that you've actually referenced in there as well. So it's a really informative read as you go through too.
I really appreciate that. I think the one thing that we really did try to do was write it in a way that people could absorb easily, rather than one of these books. Not that some of those books aren't useful, but it's nothing worse than having to read them 3 times to get everything out of it. So I think that's important. If I could say one thing to everybody, just remember, if you're thinking about this, not using Agile in your governance system is like getting the keys to a Ferrari and not getting out of first gear. Don't let that happen to your organisation. Don't end up with a complexity ceiling and making your people pay the complexity tax. Look at your governance.
Thank you.